She had done everything right. Margaret was 67 when I first reviewed her chart. She had been seen by 3 physicians in the 2 years before our appointment. Her thyroid had been tested twice, both times in normal range. Her ferritin was low normal, so she had been given iron supplements. She had a prescription for melatonin because her sleep wasn't restoring her. She had been told her fatigue was likely related to age, possibly mild depression, possibly the stress of retiring and adjusting to a slower pace. She was told to exercise more. She did. She came to me still exhausted. When I sat with her and went through the whole picture, not just each symptom in isolation, but all of them together, in sequence, over time, something didn't add up. The iron wasn't climbing the way it should have with supplementation. The sleep hadn't improved despite the melatonin and the improved routine. She had developed what she called an embarrassing pattern, bloating that would disappear for a week, then return for 3 days, then disappear again. And she mentioned, almost as an aside, something she had never told the other doctors because she didn't think it was related, a recurring itch, mostly at night. She had assumed it was dry skin. I asked one question that hadn't been asked yet. When had anyone last looked at what was happening inside her gut, not with a colonoscopy, not with a culture for common bacteria, but with a proper parasitological evaluation? Nobody had. 3 weeks later, after a comprehensive stool analysis, we had the answer. This is not a story about Margaret being unlucky or unusual. It is a story about a gap in how we think about tiredness, about digestion, about skin, and about all the small signals the body sends over months and years before anyone looks in the right place. That gap is what I want to talk about today. I'm Dr. Nora Khalil, and for 12 years I've worked with adults, mostly in the second half of life, who come to me with symptoms that have been treated but not resolved. This channel exists because I believe the body sends comprehensible signals, and that most adults over 60 are far more capable of understanding those signals than the healthcare system assumes. If this is your first time here, I'd like you to subscribe before we go further. I don't say that as a formality. I say it because this conversation is part of a longer series, and the videos connect to each other in ways that matter clinically. The subscribe button is below. Come back here. Now let's stay with the question I just raised. Intestinal parasites are not, as most Americans have come to think, a problem that belongs to other countries, other climates, other living conditions. The World Health Organization estimates that more than 1.5 billion people carry soil-transmitted helminths at any given time. That number doesn't account for protozoal infections, organisms like Giardia lamblia and Entamoeba histolytica, which are detected in water systems and food supplies across North America and Europe every year, including in places with modern sanitation infrastructure. Giardia alone is the most commonly diagnosed intestinal parasite in the United States. I'm not telling you this to alarm you. I'm telling you because the assumption that this isn't possible for you, that your lifestyle or your zip code rules it out, may be one reason why the right question never gets asked. There are 5 signals I want you to hold in your mind right now. Not because all 5 appearing together means you have a parasitic infection, but because each of them, particularly when they cluster, when they cycle, or when they persist, despite treatment of other causes, deserves a closer look. The first is fatigue that doesn't respond to sleep. This is a specific kind of tiredness. It's not the fatigue that improves after a good night's rest. It's the kind that is present in the morning as reliably as it was the night before. Patients describe it as heaviness, like something is consuming energy before they have a chance to use it. After 60, it gets dismissed easily. Age is a convenient explanation. But when fatigue doesn't shift over weeks, when it shows up alongside other gut symptoms, when it coexists with lab results that are just slightly low on iron or B12 without a clear explanation, I want to know what's happening in the gut before I accept aging as the answer. The second signal is digestive irregularity that cycles. Constipation for a few days, then loose stools, then a week of what feels like normal, then back again. People get used to this pattern. They adjust their diet, they try probiotics, they drink more water. Some of this helps temporarily, but the cycling continues. This is a pattern I've come to associate in certain patients with organisms that have their own biological rhythms, reproduction cycles, feeding cycles, that the gut responds to in waves. It's not proof of anything, but it's a pattern worth noting. The third is intense craving for sugar and refined carbohydrates. This one surprises people. They expect me to blame the craving on stress or habit or blood sugar instability. All of those are real causes. But certain parasites, particularly some helminths, rely heavily on glucose for energy. They are also capable of interfering with the gut-brain signaling that regulates appetite. I want to be clear, I am not saying that craving sugar means you have parasites. What I am saying is that when a person over 60 reports a sudden increase in carbohydrate cravings alongside fatigue and digestive cycling, with no change in their overall diet or stress levels, it's a combination that deserves investigation. The fourth signal is skin changes without an obvious cause, eczema-like patches, hives that come and go, adult acne appearing for the first time or returning after years, unusual itching on the limbs or trunk. These can all have dermatological explanations, but the gut and the skin communicate through a network of immune signaling that is far more active than most people realize. When the gut's mucosal barrier is compromised, which is one of the things certain parasites cause, immune activation can manifest on the skin in ways that seem entirely unrelated to digestion. And the fifth signal is the one Margaret was too embarrassed to mention: nocturnal perianal itching. The itch that comes at night around the rectal area that most people chalk up to hemorrhoids or dry skin or diet. This is the cardinal symptom of pinworm infection, a remarkably common parasitic infection, particularly among adults who live with children or grandchildren who attend school. Female pinworms migrate to the perianal skin at night to deposit eggs. The itch is the body's response to that migration. It's specific, and it's almost never mentioned in a medical appointment unless a physician asks directly. These 5 signals, taken alone, mean little. Together, with the right history, they become a clinical argument for a different kind of evaluation. Here is what bothers me about how this gets managed in standard clinical practice. When a physician orders a stool test for a patient with digestive complaints, what they usually order is a stool culture. A stool culture looks for bacteria: Salmonella, E. coli, Shigella, Campylobacter. It does not look for parasites. It does not look for parasitic eggs, cysts, trophozoites, or larvae. To detect intestinal parasites, you need a different test: a stool, ova, and parasite examination. And even that test has limitations because parasites don't shed eggs continuously. They do so in cycles. A single stool sample on a single day may come back negative even in an active infection. Most guidelines for suspected parasitic infection recommend testing at least 2 to 3 samples collected on separate days. Giardia and Cryptosporidium have antigen-specific tests that are more sensitive, and they should be ordered specifically if those organisms are suspected. They're not part of a standard stool culture. They have to be requested. This is the gap. A physician sees a patient with fatigue and digestive complaints. They order blood work, they order a stool culture, the results come back without a red flag, and the conversation moves on to other explanations. The right test was never ordered, not out of negligence, but because the thought didn't occur to anyone. Because parasitic infection, in the mind of most American clinicians, belongs to a different kind of patient. After 12 years, what I've come to see is this: that assumption costs people months, sometimes years, of unnecessary suffering. I have sat with patients who had been on antidepressants for fatigue-related mood changes, who had tried 3 different iron supplements without their levels improving, who had been told their digestive symptoms were IBS, when the actual explanation was sitting in their gut, undetected, because no one asked for the right test. This is the part where I have to disagree, quietly but firmly, with the tendency in medicine to treat the organ and not the ecosystem. The gut is not a collection of separate problems, it is a territory, and if something is living in that territory without belonging there, you cannot solve the downstream problems by treating them one at a time. I want you to imagine your gut as a piece of inhabited territory. The lining of the small intestine, laid flat, is roughly the size of a tennis court. It is covered in tiny projections called villi, and those villi are responsible for absorbing every nutrient your body needs. iron, B12, zinc, magnesium, fat-soluble vitamins. They are also the first line of defense between what you eat and your bloodstream. Consider what happens when an organism settles in and begins to compete for that space. Helminths, which include roundworms, hookworms, tapeworms, and pinworms, attach to the intestinal wall. Some, like hookworms, feed directly on blood. Others consume partially digested nutrients before your villi have the chance to absorb them. A moderate hookworm burden can cause daily blood loss significant enough to produce iron deficiency anemia that doesn't respond well to oral supplementation. Not because the dose is wrong, because the underlying cause isn't lack of iron coming in, it's loss of iron from within. Tapeworms are particularly efficient at depleting vitamin B12. A patient can have borderline low B12, receive supplementation, see modest improvement, and still never reach stable levels, because what's absorbing the B12 first isn't them. Protozoa, like Giardia, work differently. They don't burrow into the wall, they coat it. A heavy Giardia infestation creates a physical barrier over the absorptive surface of the small intestine, effectively insulating your villi from the nutrients passing by. The result is malabsorption that can be broad: fat, fat-soluble vitamins, carbohydrates. Giardia infection also disrupts the gut's tight junction proteins, the microscopic seals between intestinal cells that keep the contents of the gut inside the gut. When those seals weaken, the immune system inside the gut wall activates, generating low-grade inflammation that doesn't declare itself obviously but contributes over time to fatigue, cognitive fog, and immune dysregulation. This is the cycle I want you to understand because it's the part most people miss. Parasites deplete nutrients. Nutritional depletion weakens the immune response. A weaker immune response allows parasites to persist longer and in greater numbers. More parasites generate more inflammation. More inflammation damages the gut lining further. A damaged gut lining absorbs less. Less absorption produces more deficiency. The body keeps sending signals. They show up as fatigue, as skin changes, as mood shifts, as the inability to feel rested despite adequate sleep. But because each signal is treated separately, the fatigue gets a supplement, the skin gets a cream, the mood gets a medication, the loop continues. There are 4 things that change in the gut environment after 60, and each one shifts the balance in favor of an organism that doesn't belong there. The first is gastric acid. Stomach acid is a remarkably effective barrier. When the stomach is working at full capacity, the highly acidic environment kills many pathogens before they can reach the small intestine. With age, the stomach's ability to produce acid often declines, a process called hypochlorhydria. This is compounded significantly by the widespread use of proton pump inhibitors and H2 blockers in adults over 60. These medications reduce stomach acid intentionally for reflux and gastric protection. What they also reduce, as a consequence, is one of the gut's primary defenses against ingested organisms. I am not telling anyone to stop their medication. I am noting the mechanism, because understanding it matters. The second is gut motility. The rhythmic contractions that move contents through the digestive tract slow with age. Food and anything that came with it spends more time in the gut. That extended transit time gives organisms more opportunity to establish themselves. Slower motility also contributes to the cycling pattern I described earlier, the alternating constipation and loose stools that many older adults experience and accept as normal. The third is immunosenescence. The immune system ages. This is not a failure, it's a change. But the result is that the immune surveillance inside the gut, the constant monitoring that identifies and eliminates foreign organisms, becomes less responsive. Parasitic infections that a younger immune system might have cleared without producing symptoms can gain a foothold more easily after 60. And the fourth is the microbiome itself. A diverse, robust gut bacterial community creates a competitive environment. Beneficial bacteria occupy space and produce compounds that make the gut inhospitable to many pathogens. Research from the National Institute on Aging has shown that gut microbial diversity tends to decline with age. A less diverse microbiome is less resistant, and a gut environment that has already been disrupted by antibiotic use, dietary change, or chronic stress is even more vulnerable to the kind of ecological disruption that parasitic organisms cause. None of this means that everyone over 60 has a parasitic infection, but it does mean that if the body sends these signals, particularly after a period of travel, after consuming water from an uncertain source, after a gastroenteritis that never quite resolved, the threshold for investigation should be lower, not higher. I want to slow down here because I've given you a lot, and I want to make sure the practical part of this is clear. First, if you recognize several of the signals I described, chronic fatigue that doesn't improve with sleep, digestive cycling, unexplained nutritional deficiencies that don't respond to supplementation, nocturnal itching, or skin changes without a dermatological explanation, please bring this specifically to your physician's attention. Don't wait for it to be raised. Ask, by name, for a comprehensive stool, ova, and parasite examination collected on 2 or 3 separate days. If Giardia is suspected, ask for a Giardia antigen test specifically because the standard O and P exam misses it in a meaningful percentage of cases. Some clinicians will be familiar with this, others will need the direct request. I want to say something about that because I know some of you hesitate to advocate for yourselves in a medical appointment. You're not being difficult when you ask for a specific test. You are giving your physician relevant clinical information, a cluster of symptoms that warrants a particular kind of investigation, and you are asking for the tool that addresses it. That's not overstepping. That's participating in your own care. Second, confirmed parasitic infection, especially with helminths, often requires pharmaceutical treatment. There are effective, well-tolerated antiparasitic medications, albendazole, mebendazole, metronidazole for protozoa, that work. The natural approaches I'm going to discuss in a moment are supportive and preventive, and I believe in them, but I want to be direct with you. If you have a confirmed infection, please treat it with your physician. Don't substitute herbs for a diagnosis that needs a prescription. And third, if you are negative on testing but still have symptoms, that doesn't end the conversation. A single negative result doesn't rule out infection. It narrows the probability. Keep the inquiry open. My father grew up in Lebanon, and I have a clear memory of him standing at the kitchen sink every Sunday morning, soaking the vegetables we had bought at the market in salted water before anything else happened. He never explained it beyond saying, "You don't know what traveled with this." He was a careful man. I thought about him often when I started reading the research on natural antiparasitic compounds, because some of what science is finding about these plants is not entirely different from what generations of empirical tradition had already arrived at. I want to walk you through 4 of them. Garlic contains a compound called allicin, which forms when raw garlic is crushed or chopped. Multiple in vitro studies have shown that allicin has activity against a range of intestinal parasites, including Giardia lamblia and certain Entamoeba species. For this to be clinically relevant, the garlic needs to be raw, and it needs to be consumed fairly soon after preparation. Allicin degrades over time, and cooked garlic produces far less of it. A half clove to a full clove of raw garlic, chopped and allowed to rest for a few minutes before being added to food, is a practical way to incorporate this consistently. This is not a treatment for active infection. It is a reasonable addition to a gut-supportive diet. Pumpkin seeds have a long history of traditional use against intestinal worms across many cultures, and there is now some research to explain why. The active compound is cucurbitacin, which appears to cause a temporary paralysis of certain helminths, impairing their ability to maintain their grip on the intestinal wall. Studies in animal models and some small human trials have shown measurable effects. The amounts used in traditional preparations are not small. We're talking about a significant handful of raw, unsalted seeds, not a sprinkle over a salad. The consistency of use also appears to matter. One day of seeds doesn't do what a few weeks of incorporation can. Clove is the one I find genuinely interesting in this context, because its activity appears directed specifically against the eggs and early-stage larvae of certain parasites. Most antiparasitic interventions, both conventional and natural, work against adult organisms. Clove is one of the few natural compounds with demonstrated activity against the earlier reproductive forms. Eugenol, clove's primary bioactive constituent, has been studied for this specifically. If the logic holds, and I want to be transparent that much of this research is still in early stages, then clove's role is less about eliminating the adult organism and more about disrupting the next cycle. And ginger. Ginger does several things at once that are relevant here. It has documented antimicrobial and anti-inflammatory properties. It improves gut motility, which matters for mechanical expulsion, and it supports the mucosal lining of the gut in a way that appears to counter some of the barrier damage that parasitic infection causes. It's also one of the most tolerable daily additions, whether in tea, in cooking, or as a supplement, with a well-established safety profile even in older adults. What I want you to understand about these four is that they do not work like antibiotics. They are not precise, potent, or reliable enough to serve as treatment for a confirmed infection. What they can do, use consistently over time as part of a diet that also includes high dietary fiber and adequate hydration, is make the gut environment less hospitable, support the immune function within the gut lining, and contribute to a daily biochemical environment that is harder for organisms to exploit. Fiber deserves a separate mention. Soluble fiber from sources like oats, flaxseed, and cooked legumes acts as what I often describe to patients as scaffolding for everything the gut does. It slows digestion appropriately, feeds beneficial bacteria, and binds certain waste products for elimination. When the gut is working to clear an unwanted organism or recovering from having hosted one, fiber is the unglamorous, reliable support structure that makes the rest possible. Most adults over 60 consume far less fiber than their gut needs. I want to give you clear guidance on when the signals I described cross into something that needs medical attention promptly, not eventually. If you have unintentional weight loss alongside the fatigue and digestive symptoms, see a physician soon. If you have visible blood in your stool, or stools that are consistently pale, greasy, or foul-smelling in a new way, that also warrants prompt evaluation. If the fatigue is severe enough to interfere with daily function, if you feel genuinely unable to carry out activities you could manage a year ago, that's not a signal to manage at home. If you have recently traveled, particularly to areas with less reliable water treatment, or if you've had a gastrointestinal illness in the past several months that seemed to resolve but left you with persistent symptoms, fatigue, bloating, irregular stools, that combination is a clear indication for testing. And if you are immunocompromised for any reason, including medications that suppress the immune system, the threshold for testing should be lower, and the conversation with your physician should happen sooner. The goal of everything I've described today is not to replace that conversation. It's to help you walk into it better informed, more specific about your symptoms, and clearer about what you're asking for. That makes a real clinical difference. Here is what I keep coming back to after 12 years of these conversations. The body does not send ambiguous signals. It sends specific ones. Fatigue that doesn't respond to sleep is a specific signal. Digestive symptoms that cycle on their own schedule are a specific signal. Nutritional levels that don't improve with supplementation are a specific signal. The problem is not that the body is unclear. The problem is that we have a habit of sorting those signals into separate drawers. Fatigue goes to the energy drawer, digestion goes to the gastroenterology drawer, skin goes to the dermatology drawer, and nobody stands back to ask what might connect them. What connects them in cases like Margaret's is sometimes something that simply was not looked for. She recovered, her iron normalized. Her sleep changed, the cycling stopped. Not overnight, because these things take time, and they require proper treatment followed by real rehabilitation of the gut environment, but she got better, and she told me at a follow-up appointment that for 2 years she had been told the problem was her age. She was 67. She had 30 years ahead of her. That's the part that stays with me. Now, if this conversation about the gut's inner ecology has your attention, I want to connect you to something we covered in a recent episode that becomes significantly more relevant after what you've heard today. Because once you understand that intestinal parasites can disrupt the gut's bacterial environment, depleting beneficial organisms, creating inflammation, altering the conditions that bacteria need to thrive, the question of how to restore that bacterial community becomes urgent. And in that earlier episode, I walked through something specific, a forgotten spice with a remarkable ability to clear certain harmful bacteria from the gut after 60. Not a probiotic, not a supplement, something your kitchen may already have. The link is in the description. I'd suggest watching it as a second chapter to this one, because the gut's recovery from any disruption, including what we've talked about today, happens in layers. And the bacterial layer is one that most people miss entirely. Take care of yourself. Pay attention to what your body is telling you.